Hello, I'm Langston, and I'm back on my channel, Military Election Forecasting. Today I'm going to be talking about the myth of moderate Republicans and their guaranteed path to the White House in 2070. So it's a common consensus amongst conservatives that if they nominate anyone besides Trump or a more moderate Republican, that they can win. And I want to point out the fact that Mitt Romney and John McCain were much more moderate than Donald Trump, and they lost by larger margins than Donald Trump. So many people point to other Republicans. We're talking about Asa Hutchinson. We're talking about, and most notably, Glenn Youngkin, as well as Brian Kemp and numerous others having the political prowess to be able to prevail in a head-to-head matchup with Joe Biden. I do want to point out that Joe Biden is not Barack Obama. But Joe Biden is not as easy of a Democratic candidate for Republicans to beat as they assume. And when you underestimate someone, you get defeated by them. And if Republicans have not learned anything from Katie Hobbs and from John Fetterman, they should learn from this. You can attack Joe Biden on a daily for, him being, not the most aware, not the most, enthusiastic, not having any energy, being, very lazy as a candidate, you could say. But I mean, let's just be realistic. We had Katie Hobbs that avoided debating, and we had John Fetterman that had a stroke, who had a terrible debate performance. So again, it did not stop voters from voting for them. It's not going to stop voters from voting for Joe Biden in 2024. So I wanted to address this because people are always talking about Glenn Youngkin as if he's some Republican dream candidate that can win. And I want to point to the fact that Glenn Youngkin's victory was a victory based off of certain circumstances rather than a victory based off of Virginia's electorate. And when we look at these 2021 Virginia exit polls, you'll see that. Um, Something I want to point out the most is I want to go down and look at something. So yeah, we obviously see the race and the gender makeup of this, but one of the most important things I noticed in particular was the fact that if you look at the racial breakdown of Virginia, you'll see that white voters made up 73% of Virginia's electorate. You back in 2016, Hillary Clinton, who was a pretty weak Democratic candidate, when she ran, they only made up 67% of the electorate. So a 6% increase amongst white voters, as well as I'm sorry, black voters made up 15%, 16% in this exit poll. Obviously, exit polls are always correct versus 21% in 2016. So, again, a 6% increase amongst white voters and a 5% decrease in the share of black voters in a state that Glenn Youngkin barely won. It does become apparent that Glenn Youngkin's victory was based off of numerous factors. I do want to point out that Glenn Youngkin made significant gains amongst, not significant, but, some somewhat substantial gains amongst college-educated voters, especially in a DMV area. He still lost those voters tremendously. Like, he lost those voters by much larger margins than Barack Obama did in 2012, and by basically the same amount that Donald Trump did in 2016. And I want to point out that when you have the most Democratic base, which is obviously black voters, not turning out at a high rate, states are going to vote tremendously more Republican. And we talk about this in Georgia, for example, for Brian Kemp. I just looked at some exit polls, and the 2020 gubernatorial race in Georgia was a R+5, R+6 environment, which means if it was Trump versus Biden, Trump would have won the state by 5 points. And I'm gonna scroll down to this right here. For example, this was a D+4 environment. So if this would have been held, this means that McAuliffe would have, if the election would have been held this day, that means Joe Biden would have only won Virginia by 4 points. We know that Joe Biden won Virginia by 10 points. Why he's severely underperformed, mainly because of the Democratic base, particularly being black voters, not turning out at the margins that they needed to, give Democrats a sizable victory in Virginia. So with that, Democrats did not do so well in Virginia as well in 2022 as well. Democrats across the whole South really struggled with getting out black voters out to the polls. Something you saw in states like Alabama, and South Carolina shifting dramatically to the right, where Democrats really struggling in North Carolina and Georgia, which was really notable because North Carolina and Georgia had two black candidates on the ballot, and the fact that Democrats still struggle with getting black voters out to the polls was something that many people noted that Joe Biden would realistically have a problem worrying about. You have Republicans overturning things like affirmative action and many numerous other policies. And I mean, people can, like, I know the polls have affirmative action being unpopular, but let's just be realistic. Like, the perception of what affirmative action is versus the policy of affirmative action are two very different things. If you put on the ballot, do you believe that certain minority groups should, have access to college, at a higher rate? People are going to vote for that. Versus when you're saying, oh, should, we just take people based off their skin color? Like, the wording of thing makes a huge difference. And when you're doing things to motivate these voters to come out in full force, you're going to lose. That's just what it is. And the problem for Republicans is they cannot acknowledge that they're losing. You cannot acknowledge that you're losing. You can't come up with a strategy to win. And you have Republicans thinking that, Glenn Youngkin is the answer to this, because when you're looking at this electorate, it's very apparent that Glenn Youngkin won because of the circumstances. He did not win because of changing the Democratic electorate. He changed the electorate that showed up on election day. And that's all that matters. When you have a state, when you see a spike in turnout from white voters and older voters, and a decrease in turnout from black voters and minority demographic groups across the country, you're going to see a Republican-friendly electorate, which is something that you saw in the South tremendously back in 2022, 2021. And it's something Republicans need to know. Because regardless of the truth, like, I definitely think that Donald Trump is not a strong candidate. I think that he's probably the strongest the Republicans have to nominate, because he got the closest of all Republicans this election. And I want to point out that Republicans have not put together a winning coalition since the 80s, with Ronald Reagan. And thinking that running someone like Glenn Youngkin is going to make a difference is really in denial to the principle of what younger voters, to the principle of what black voters and Latino voters and Asian American voters, as well as LGBT voters, which are the prime Democratic electorate across these states, which are growing. They're growing. And what Republicans don't understand is, while you're seeing white voters decrease in the population share, you're seeing black voters increase. And as long as that continues, especially in states like Virginia, Democrats are going to continue gaining, because they're gaining with college-educated voters, they're gaining with the share of black voters in the state, and that's going to shift Virginia left. And regardless if you run someone like Glenn Youngkin, you're still going to lose. And people need to understand that Mitt Romney was the governor of Massachusetts. Massachusetts is one of the most Democratic states in the country, a state that Joe Biden won by more than 30 points. And did it matter? Like, did voters think that he was the governor of Massachusetts? Like, did Massachusetts voters care when he was running for president? No. So what people need to understand about candidates like Glenn Youngkin, candidates like Brian Kemp, candidates like Republicans across the country, the shift against Republicans is a shift that is ideological. It's a shift against policy. It's a shift against these voters in general. It has nothing to do with candidates in general. And I do want to point out that some candidates are, worse than others. Obviously, we're talking about Donald Trump, Carrie Lake, numerous others that are obviously worse. But regardless, the shift in the suburbs is something that was happening long before Trump, and without Trump, it would have still happened. We probably would not have been seeing the suburbs this Democratic friendly as of now without him, but you would have still seen them. So again, running someone like Glenn Youngkin is not going to change America becoming majority as a country. The rapid increase in Hispanic and Asian American voters across the country, as well as more voters that turn 18 voting every year, which is going to benefit Democrats. So until Republicans can acknowledge the problem, until Republicans can acknowledge why they're losing, they cannot come up with a strategy to win. And I think that many people might take this video as being biased, but I'm not being biased at all. What I want is a strong opposition. Something that Joe Biden said is, when you don't have a strong opposition, the country will falter. And I'm not quoting Joe Biden's words to use him, as a better candidate, or et cetera. I'm just saying that anyone can, make a great statement. And I think that statement is important. We need a strong Democrat, strong and Republican Party, because only when you have strong people, ideological polar opposites, is when you can come together and make a strong middle. And when Republicans not being so out of touch with the American electorate, they're preparing themselves for defeat. So again, I'm Langston, and I wanted to upload this video on my channel. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and make sure to have a nice day, you guys. Goodbye.